The young surveyor who dreamed big in the heart of Virginia, on a sprawling estate surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, George Washington's journey began. Born in 1732, his world was simple: farms, rivers, and the steady rhythm of colonial life. Yet, from an early age, he was marked by an ambition far greater than the small world around him. At age 11, tragedy struck. George's father, Augustine Washington, passed away, leaving him and his siblings under care of his mother, Mary. The death left a deep void in the young boy's heart, but also ignited a fierce sense of responsibility. With the loss of his father, George had to mature quickly, and in doing so, he learned the true weight of leadership, caring for others when no one was watching, making hard decisions, and accepting the burden of the future. The years followed were filled with early lessons in survival and discipline. George, now a teenager, had a growing fascination with the wilderness. He studied the art of land surveying, a skill that took him across the Virginia backcountry. These early journeys, sometimes dangerous, were more than just a job for him. They were a test of character. As he roamed the untamed forests, marking borders and measuring land, his mind wandered to greater things. What lay beyond the hills, what secrets the forest held, and how he could shape a future where his name was remembered. But for now, the young surveyor was just one among many, quietly walking through forests, measuring life's vastness in feet and miles. At 17, George set off on his first solo surveying expedition, crossing rugged terrain in search of the unknown. With each passing day, as the sun dipped behind towering trees and cold winds howled to the branches, George felt the tug of something greater, the call to serve, to lead, to one day stand on the other side of the river, gazing out at the world he would one day change. It was on these journeys that George's character began to reveal itself. Persistent, unyielding, and forever curious. There were no grand accolades, no crowd cheering his name, only the quiet, steady rhythm of his work and his thoughts. Yet, deep down, he carried the seeds of something more, an unspoken belief that he was destined for something greater than this life of surveys and borders. His days as a young surveyor were the calm before the storm. The world around him was changing, and so was George. Little did he know that this journey into the wilderness would one day prepare him for a far greater test, a battle for freedom, for a nation, and for a future he could barely dream of. But first, he had to conquer the wilderness inside himself. And so, the young boy with a surveying compass would soon discover that his true calling was not in the measured lines of land, but in the measured steps of a leader walking into history. The reluctant warrior. At the age of 21, George Washington found himself on the edge of a world far removed from the peaceful forests of Virginia. The year was 1753, and the growing tensions between the British and the French over North American territories threatened to erupt into war. A young man still, George was thrust into the fray, sent on a dangerous mission to deliver a message to the French in the Ohio Valley, demanding they leave the land claimed by the British. It was a mission that would forever alter the course of his life. The journey was treacherous. The wild terrain of the frontier offered no mercy, and along the way, Washington faced not just the raw power of nature, but also the complexities of diplomacy and warfare. During his trip, he was forced to confront not only the hostile French forces, but also the uncertainty of his own abilities. The message he carried was one of defiance, but George himself was filled with doubt. He was no seasoned general, no battle-hardened veteran. He was merely a young man trying to navigate a path between duty and fear. When the French refused to leave, Washington found himself at the head of a small militia, battling in the snow at Fort Necessity. The outcome was not glorious. He was forced to surrender, a humbling experience that weighed heavily on his young heart. The bitter taste of defeat was sharp, yet fueled a fire within him. He realized that war was not a game of glory or glory alone. It was about survival, sacrifice, and resilience. This moment was a turning point. Washington's reputation as a leader was born not in the victories he would later achieve, but in the way he responded to failure. Though he had lost a battle, he had not lost his resolve. He returned to Virginia and became deeply involved in the colonial militia, determined to learn from his mistakes and grow into the leader his country might need one day. Years passed, and the young man who had once questioned his place in the world now knew the way to command. In 1758, during the French and Indian War, Washington rose to the challenge once more, leading troops in battle with a newfound sense of confidence. But the war was not kind to him either. The battles were long, the victories few, and the losses painful. Yet, with each struggle, George Washington became something more than a soldier. He became a reluctant warrior. He was not driven by the thirst for battle, nor the glory of conquest, but by a deep sense of duty, a call to something higher than himself. His men looked to him not for his experience, but for his integrity and his courage in the face of adversity. Washington had learned the true cost of war and the price of leadership, the constant, unrelenting weight of decision-making. As the war came to an end, Washington was no longer just a young surveyor. He had been forged in the fire of conflict, and though the road ahead was uncertain, the lessons of battle would follow him, guiding him, shaping him, for the battles yet to come. The president who walked away. By 1783, the war was over. The British had surrendered, and America had won its independence. George Washington, the man who led a ragtag army through nearly impossible odds, stood victorious. Yet, as he gazed over the sprawling fields of the new nation, there was no triumph in his heart. The cost of war had taken its toll. The lives lost, the sacrifices made, and the bitter divisions that had surfaced. He was a hero, yes, but also a man deeply weary of the violence and division that had shaped his life. Washington knew that the future of this new nation rested not just on military victory, but on the fragile foundation of a working government. And so, despite his deep desire to return to the peace of Mount Vernon, he was called once again into service. The newly formed United States was a nation without a blueprint, without a leader who could unite its people. Amid the chaos and uncertainty, there was one name that echoed to the halls of Congress: George Washington. Reluctantly, he accepted the call. In 1789, Washington became the first president of the United States. Yet, even as he took the oath of office, there was a part of him that remained uncertain, even fearful. He was a soldier, not a politician. He had led armies to victory, but now he was to lead a fractured nation through a new kind of battle, one of diplomacy, compromise, and unity. The challenges were immediate. The country was deeply divided, with political factions already forming and differing visions for the future. Washington, never a man of many words, understood that the strength of this new government lay not in the power of any one individual, but in the collective will of the people. He worked tirelessly, setting precedents for the office that would shape the presidency for generations to come. He established the first cabinet, organized the nation's finances, and worked with Congress to ensure the survival of the fledgling republic. Yet, even as he shaped the future of America, Washington's heart was not at ease. He had no desire for power or glory. He had never sought this office, and in many ways, he felt like an outsider in the world of politics. The weight of leadership was a burden he did not take lightly, and as the years passed, his longing to return to Mount Vernon only grew stronger. In his second term, Washington was offered an opportunity that most men in his position would have seized: to become a king. The idea of monarchy was still alive in the minds of many, but Washington rejected it with unwavering conviction. He had fought for freedom, not for power. The presidency was not a crown, and he would not wear it as such. As he prepared to leave office, Washington issued a farewell address that would echo through the centuries. He warned against the dangers of political factions and foreign entanglements, urging the nation to remain united and true to the principles of liberty. His decision to step away from power was one of the most profound acts of leadership in history. George Washington, the reluctant warrior, had now become the reluctant president, and in doing so, he had forged a legacy that would shape the future of a nation. His departure from the office was not a surrender, but a victory in itself. A victory for democracy, for selflessness, and for a vision of leadership grounded in service rather than ambition. The man who could have ruled like a king had chosen instead to walk away, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire generations. The father of a nation. After his presidency, George Washington returned to the peaceful life he had longed for, a quiet existence at Mount Vernon, where he could tend to his land, his crops, and his legacy. But even in retirement, he could not escape the weight of his country's future. Though the United States had gained its independence, the young nation was far from stable. There were still many challenges ahead: political divisions, foreign threats and the ever-present tension between freedom and control. In the quiet of his estate, Washington often reflected on the choices he had made, the burdens he had borne, and the sacrifices he had seen others endure. He was not a perfect man. Like all leaders, he had his flaws. His mistakes were many, and his doubts often loomed large. Yet, it was his humility, his unwavering sense of duty, that defined his legacy. He had led a nation not out of desire for power, but out of a deep, unshakable belief in the principles of liberty and unity. As he aged, Washington became increasingly reflective. The fires of revolution had cooled, but the work of building a nation was far from over. He knew that the future of America depended on more than just military victories or political power. It depended on the hearts and minds of the people. And as much as he longed for peace, Washington could not ignore the call of duty when his nation needed him most. In 1799, just a few years after his retirement, Washington fell ill. On a cold December night, as snow blanketed the land outside, he knew his time was near. Though his health had been failing, he refused to let others suffer for his illness. Even in his final hours, Washington insisted on the well-being of his country. His mind remained sharp, his resolve unwavering. As his last breath drew near, his final words were simple: "'Tis well." The nation mourned his passing deeply. George Washington was no longer just a man. He was the embodiment of the American ideal, a reluctant hero, a man who had fought not for glory but for the greater good. He had led not out of ambition, but out of duty. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy was far from over. In the years that followed, his example endured. Washington's refusal to seek power, his choice to step away from the presidency, became a symbol of the democratic ideals that the United States held dear. He had taught the nation that true leadership was not about ruling, but about serving. And through his example, America learned that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when to let go. George Washington's name would live on, not just in the history books, but in the very principles that would guide the nation for centuries. He was not just the first president of the United States. He was its father, and his legacy, grounded in sacrifice, humility, and service, would forever remain a beacon for all who sought to lead with honor and integrity.